Welcome, everyone. Good day, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you find yourself when you're watching this webinar. Today is the last of the current series of webinars that is jointly hosted by the Wilmette Institute and EBBF. EBBF, of course, is the Ethical Business Building the Future organization that is trying to share new ways of thinking and new ways of sharing values around the practices of business, whether we're talking for profit or non-profits, trying to help us move forward in terms of civilization building. And today we have a very special guest. Rhonda Gossen will be sharing with us, and she's bringing her own guests into this webinar. She'll be introducing them. But just to get an idea of who Rhonda is, she is a consultant for the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program Crisis Bureau, and is a former manager in the Department of Global Affairs Canada. She has worked on humanitarian and crisis response in South Sudan, Nepal, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Southern Africa, and on the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon, and more recently on the Rohingya refugee crisis in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. She's a former Canadian diplomat working in Asia and Africa, and Rhonda was posted in the Philippines, Ghana, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So we can all see that she is a well-traveled person, but also has experienced life in or has seen life in its most difficult times in crisis around the world. And we are hoping that we can all learn about that from that experience and reflect together on how we are responding as humanity and as individuals to those emerging crises. So welcome, Rhonda. Thank you so much for sharing what you've learned and what you see as the near future for us.
Thank you, Vahid. Yes, I have two colleagues joining today who will be coming in with short commentaries as well based on their amazing field experience. Clark Soriano, an UN international consultant, and Hamza Ansari, who's been recently returned from Bangladesh working with Bangladesh NGOs. So I'll introduce them a little bit more substantively later, but they'll be coming in after a few minutes as well. So thank you. It's an exciting time to be talking about humanitarianism. Of course, we're all facing some form of humanitarian crisis in our lives at the moment. With this pandemic, it's touched everybody everywhere. And it certainly has, accelerated discussions on changes that need to be made, how to do things better, the future of aid, just how it's transforming everything in the humanitarian sector. And the new Humanitarian, for anyone who might be familiar with them, is an independent organization based out of Geneva. They've just launched a new series online discussion on rethinking humanitarianism. Very interesting conversations going on, and very deep reflection and rethinking of humanitarian aid, including even the fundamental definition of what we would consider humanitarian or a humanitarian crisis. So I put the link in the slides to that discussion, so we'll see more about that later. But the humanitarian sector is the nonprofit sector. So although EBBF is an organization that talks mainly about business and workplace environments in the private sector, I found it interesting to see the crossover in EBBF's core values and the core humanitarian principles, especially human nobility and the humanity angle of humanitarianism, but also service and justice, and of course, sustainability, which we'll be talking about a little bit more, a big challenge for the humanitarian sector. So first, I just wanted to frame the discussion today by just giving a glimpse of the humanitarian situation around the world. These are just examples of sort of what's going on presently. It doesn't by any means touch the massive humanitarian sector. And it's also, I'll also actually qualify my talk to say I'm not going to hope to cover everything that could be talked about on humanitarian system, but we'll just touch on a few areas. So there's numerous protracted humanitarian crises underway, as we all know, but they're getting bigger and longer and larger. And that's what's also driving the transformative changes needed by the sector. I think the ones that come up on our TV screen are the ones that we are most familiar with: the Syrian refugee crisis, which is now entering its 10th year, the Sahel crisis, maybe less on our screen, but more than 10 years of conflict in West and Central Africa. 24 million people in the Sahel region of Africa need life-saving assistance in 2020 alone, according to UN OCHA. And I found interesting that 64% of the population of the Sahel is under the age of 25 and mostly unemployed. Afghanistan, we know, we hear about all the time, 20 plus years of conflict since 9/11, but even before 9/11, they were facing conflict. And South Sudan, of course, ongoing, 7.4 million people in need of humanitarian assistance this year. And we all know about the number of refugees, and there's at least 12 million stateless people in the world. And apparently about 79 million forcibly displaced people, which includes internally displaced as well as refugees. So the humanitarian system has become a huge, sprawling, multi-billion-dollar industry to deal with these crises. I mean, in 2020 now, the UN launched its largest appeal in history, $36 billion for 63 countries. A good chunk of that is for COVID, which is why it's larger, but it's still, it was still sizable even before COVID. But it's amazing to see this global humanitarian system kick into place when a crisis hits. And my most recent experience was in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh during the Rohingya crisis. I was there during the first 8 months of the scale up, what they call a scale up of an L3 emergency, level emergency. And it's amazing how quickly the whole logistics, supply chain system, coordination system, everything just comes into place. And I think where I saw it most significantly was South Sudan, and flying on a UN peacekeeping flight, going to the airport where, you know, the UN had actually built the airport, the runways. There were lineups of planes and helicopters for every single international NGO and humanitarian organization you can think of, from the Red Cross to Médecins Sans Frontières to all of the UN agencies. I mean, it's just amazing. And they had even put in place a telecommunication system. But the structure is often criticized for being obsolete, sort of based on this post-World War II system, really of Western-dominated organizations and models, which are often seen to be imposed on poorer regions or imposed on areas in crisis. But there's a lot of call for reform of the aid industry coming from the need for it to have more sustainable approaches because of the size. The cost is unbearable. It's getting very, very difficult to fund it. But there's a deep self-reflection and changes going on. And I mentioned the new Humanitarian, which has the link there. But one of the main milestones was the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, which really did call for serious transformative changes in the sector. And something called the Grand Bargain was signed, which was a commitment to reforms, to greater transparency, but really to bringing people who receive aid into the decision-making process, and also to getting more resources to local and national responders, as opposed to the international organizations getting most of the funding. And in 2018, the UN General Assembly saw the signature of the Global Compact on Refugees, very important compact signed by over 163 countries. The purpose was really to move people away from humanitarian assistance to broader inclusion in society and to enhance self-reliance of refugees, and also to really recognize the importance of international responsibility sharing for refugees. So not just host countries bearing all the brunt, but everyone sharing in the responsibilities. So I'd like to just talk mainly about 3 areas where I've seen change being driven in the sector. It's over the last, I would say, almost decade. But I think some of these things are being accelerated now with the COVID pandemic. So localization, building resilience of affected populations, and third, strengthening capacity of existing systems and structures. All of this to ensure a more sustainable response and more lasting solutions to humanitarian crisis. But of course, what does this really mean in practice? And I think the first area, localization, which is a bit of an odd term, is a very important one and becoming increasingly important now with COVID. And I like the quote from the UN Secretary General at the World Humanitarian Summit, where he said, "People are the central agents of their lives, and are the first and last responders to any crisis. The concept is important in my view because it recognizes the need for sort of a systemic power shift to local organizations and solutions. So sort of moving away from a top-down approach and recognizing the need for more of a bottom-up approach, or at least a meeting of the two. It's a commitment that's made, but still, as the New Humanitarian has said, they're Western-dominated institutions, still are in a position to dictate how poorer countries should solve their problems. This is something we do need to change. And the Baha'i International Community, based out of New York, accredited to the United Nations as an NGO, contributes significantly to UN summits and makes statements and contributions to declarations. They've said social change is not a project that one group of people should carry out on behalf of another, and that we should operate on the ideal of universal participation. But the concept of ownership, of individuals and communities having ownership over their own aid programs and solutions is a long-standing principle that's been in fact in the international development field for a long time, but it's still very, very relevant today. But when you go to a humanitarian crisis, I think one of the questions are, where are the local actors? Often the first responders in a crisis are neighbors, church groups, mosques, local community organizations, but often these community responders are rarely acknowledged by the humanitarian sector as formal aid. So this also is a constant challenge for the sector. I think now with border restrictions, we're seeing definitely a reduced need for deploying hundreds of international staff and for the need to engage local organizations. Especially because of travel restrictions. It's become almost critical now. I like the quote from the Baha'i International Community on local communities, how they should be drivers of their own resilience and how they can support their own material and spiritual advancement. And so examples from the field, I'll come back to the Rohingya crisis because two organizations took a very strong role in the crisis response. BRAC, who my colleague Hamza Ansari will speak to in a few minutes, very important, large Bangladeshi NGO, and COAST, which was a local NGO based out of Cox's Bazar, where the Rohingya arrived. And they demanded a very strong role in the decision-making level of the international humanitarian response to the Rohingya crisis. They formed a coalition of local NGOs in Cox's Bazar. They demanded a seat at the table, and they were given a seat at the UN Strategic Executive Committee level in Dhaka on the response. I was tasked at one point for organizing a full-day consultative workshop with them and the local civil society to try to hear voices, to have a better dialogue between them. There was a lot of tension, actually, and it was a push and pull. It wasn't as easy as one would think. But they were strong enough to sort of stand up to that big international system and demand a seat at the table. But one example I really liked in Cox's Bazar was UNHCR's efforts to introduce a system of elected representative governance in the refugee camps. And that was unique to me. I had not seen that before. And it was a wonderful effort to have elections, a gender-based elective process of local Rohingya refugees, male and female, forming committees as a way to really have a better system of dialogue, of discussion, and of decision-making between the international system and the Rohingya refugees, and also to look at self-governance. It wasn't extended to the entire camp of 1 million people, I don't believe, because certain people were responsible for organizing parts of the camp versus others, but it was certainly a great initiative, innovative initiative. The second area is building resilience at individual, community, and institutional levels. These three protagonists are very important, certainly in the hard perspective on response. And resilience building has been definitely ingrained now in humanitarian organizations. They all have resilience as part of their planning and programming process, building in resilient responses at all levels. But to actually do it in practice is another story. UNDP was who I worked for is definitely credited with bringing that resilience-based focus and concept to humanitarian crisis. They did a lot of work at all levels on that and sent people like me in to work in humanitarian crisis in the coordination system to try to further the concept and make it implementable. But I like the example from Vanuatu of how resilience was built, even just between 2015 and 2020. And in 2015, there was a cyclone in Vanuatu, and the local Baha'i community was able to respond on their own, based on their own organizational processes. And I love the quote about how they said that they didn't depend on aid donors, but they took charge of their own development, and for the future reconstruction process, drew on their own tools and instruments that they'd used in community advancement. By April 2020, there was another cyclone that hit. Now, that was right in the height of COVID. So the Vanuatu did not want, the border was closed, essentially. They didn't want people coming in. And the Vanuatu Red Cross basically issued a statement saying, our people are empowered, we're not waiting for help from the outside, and we're going to do it ourselves, which obviously they had built up enough capacity to feel they could do that. I'm not saying outside help is never not needed, it is, but it's an interesting example of empowerment. But often humanitarians, I found, think of resilience as supporting livelihoods, small-scale livelihoods for affected people, either displaced refugees or vulnerable people affected by an earthquake or other natural disaster. They're mainly micro-level activities, cash for work, vocational training, daily labor jobs. You know, some of the training is like 2 days on using a sewing machine or handicrafts, or sometimes it's very, very unsustainable type activities. And they're important sometimes in a part of an emergency, but in a protracted humanitarian crisis, they're just not sustainable. They're more social safety net oriented, sometimes even charity oriented, as opposed to something that's really going to provide sufficient income for self-reliance. The third and last area is the area of strengthening existing systems and institutions. And I think this has also become ingrained in the humanitarian thinking these days, but the importance of connecting to expanding and strengthening existing structures and systems instead of creating parallel emergency systems, and also reinforcing rather than replacing national and local systems is absolutely critical. Again, this is an area that UNDP has done a lot of work in, and I've also been called in to help work with humanitarian organizations to make better connections to local government. In Nepal, we worked with the district governments in the post-earthquake response, really getting them more involved, working closely with them, and also building their capacity, building local governance, supporting them as much as possible to strengthen their own services. But one great successful innovation in the humanitarian area is using cash as a modality in humanitarian response, as opposed to distributing goods and services, as opposed to distributing food or supplies or jerry cans or whatever. And this has really taken off, and I think was highly successful in the Syrian refugee crisis. Humanitarians now give out debit cards to, let's say, refugees, for example. They're uploaded every month with cash. They're able to spend that money pretty much as they want. Sometimes they're in certain accredited grocery stores or supply stores, but nevertheless, it definitely has proven to contribute to poverty reduction and some level of self-reliance and self-sufficiency. And it's much more efficient. But it does beg the question of, do you need all these large organizations and supply chains in places where you can just do cash and debit responses? But I've certainly seen increased discussion around the need for cash responses and universal basic income during the pandemic. I think this is an area that's going to increasingly grow. A good example is Turkey and the Syrian refugee crisis, which recently transferred the emergency cash transfer system for refugees into their national social protection system and included refugees in it, along with vulnerable Turkish citizens. So it became a strengthened system overall for social protection and included refugees in it, so highly successful. Whereas Lebanon it kind of did the opposite. They had a huge cash transfer program for Syrian refugees, but a very tiny one that was started for vulnerable, poor Lebanese who were living side by side in communities with refugees and not receiving the emergency cash. So actually, I was working in 2014 where I met Clark Soriano, who's going to come on shortly, on the National Poverty Targeting Program in Lebanon, which was a program launched by the World Bank, UNHCR, and WFP to provide monthly cash transfers for food vouchers for vulnerable Lebanese who were hosting in the host communities of Syrian refugees. But the sad thing was, the two systems continued parallel. So the emergency system continued parallel and the national system continued parallel. The national system was never strengthened enough. It's still going on, but it's very weak. And we've seen a huge increase in poverty in Lebanon recently, both in Syrian refugee households, but also with Lebanese themselves. Positive examples, though, are how the national education and health system were expanded and strengthened in Lebanon to include Syrian refugees in them. So before I go further, I think I will actually have my colleagues come in, and I'd like to call on Clark Soriano, who has such amazing experience working in Liberia on the Ebola crisis and in Sudan during the Darfur crisis and many other areas. He's now a coach and an advisor for senior UN staff. So Clark.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you for a really excellent presentation. It's really quite innovative to start off immediately with a values-based approach. I like the fact that you flash the core beliefs of EBBF. And it's quite exciting to frame your analysis around these values. And I'd like to jump a little bit into this bandwagon and use EBBF's operational concepts to frame my comments. So starting with consultation, collaboration, and accompaniment. I love the way that Rhonda emphasizes these three concepts in all your examples. Now, this is important regionally, especially because the crisis does not respect borders. And it's important not only to develop consultation systems within countries, but also across civil society, business groups, the UN, governments across the borders. The 3RP, the resilience and refugee response in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, is an example of how one can do regional collaboration. This is also important globally in the face of COVID-19 and in the face of this backlash against multilateralism that we are facing today. The fifth and sixth EBBF concept is all about learning and a learning community. I have a couple of reflections here. One is digital technology. Already we are seeing organizations use smartphones, cashless systems to provide people with the resources that they need. It's important to look at issues here related to access, content, getting more and more people to access the kind of systems that we in countries like Canada, the US, the UK are used to. Now, what is interesting about the COVID-19, and I'll shift a little bit, is many of us are learning from the Ebola experience. That is learning from low and middle income countries by high income countries. Mm-hmm. And it's important more and more to recognize that learning is two-way. And the other reflection I have on this is that more countries today are becoming middle income. Many of our humanitarian and even development frameworks are oriented for low income countries. Now, if you move into influencing middle income countries, maybe it's time to shift from a more project oriented focus to humanitarian development work to one that is more focused on policy, that builds on local capacity, and looks at more inter-country exchanges. EBBF talks about a seventh concept, the new paradigm. And here I want to echo or amplify Rhonda's point about universal basic income and temporary, what the UNDP recently came out with a study on temporary basic income.
Yes, true.
We can do it now under COVID-19. Why should not we think about doing it as a preventive measure even beyond COVID-19? You know, countries like Canada, Spain, Togo are putting these systems in place. Perhaps it's a system to look at even beyond the crisis. Now, the other thing about this is we all love the blue skies during the lockdown. You know, suddenly we started seeing less of the smog before the lockdown. Now, look at what's happening to Bogota, Mexico, Delhi, and Bangkok. They've expanded their bike lanes in urban spaces. Perhaps it's time to build on, you know, this momentum for climate change and integrate more into the frameworks we use for humanitarian development work. It's there, but it should be amplified further. EBBF talks about a new work ethic. During COVID-19, we were all forced to work at home. This meant learning new skills in caring about the persons we love alongside our work. It meant trying to move towards a better work-life balance. What can we learn from this? What can we do more about caring for the people in the front line? What new human resource policies can we institutionalize to ensure that the men and women in the front line not only fulfill their responsibilities to deliver aid, but also their responsibilities for their children, for the future generations of the world we live in? Business ethics, number 9. My favorite example here is the cooperation between UNDP, UNICEF, and WhatsApp on fact checking and providing information on COVID-19. You cited the work of in Vanuatu. You know, in Vanuatu, there was something else that was happening there. Oxfam and the Business Council of Vanuatu were working together in using smartphones and a cashless system to shift, allow the decision making on what kinds of products and services were needed during a crisis to the people themselves. Mm-hmm. Lastly, EBBF talks about responsibility, and I equate that with accountability. The current humanitarian accountability architecture is based on the donors. The cluster system is based on donor priorities. Recent work in countries like the Middle East during the height of the Syrian crisis show that it's not only the cluster system that can work. They adopted a sectoral system that is entirely different. What this suggests is that there is room for flexibility. And that's where I want to leave I want to end my presentation with a question. What can we do to move decision making more to local levels? Mm-hmm. After all, you know, people faced by the crisis don't think about a response in a siloed way. You know, they also talk about respect, the need for community solidarity, and the need to be in control of their lives. Over.
Thank you, Clark. That was so useful. I loved your point on learning from low-income countries, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. But in fact, maybe that's a good segue into Hamza, who's going to talk briefly about the Bangladesh organization BRAC. So Hamza.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rhonda, for having me. It's a pleasure to see you. And thanks, everyone, for being here. I recently returned from Bangladesh in March, where I was working with BRAC. Just to, I guess, mention on the COVID scenario, it was quite rough there because in developing countries, the healthcare system is not as strong. And things like, I think we take more for granted in places like Canada or developed countries, where we can do social distancing and we can get testing was very difficult there. In fact, when I was quite concerned because I spent a lot of time in Dhaka and I was connecting with my colleagues there over the phone. And they told me that, Hamza, most of us are okay, we're at home, but there's a large percentage, I think maybe 60 million or so people there that are relying on daily wages. And so, they have to earn for the next day for survival, for their food, for their shelter. So a lot of people were on the streets, and, sort of their financial system isn't as robust as ours, where, there's programs government can do to transfer money to them. So they really, they suffered a lot there for a while, and I think they still are. But BRAC actually happens to be the largest NGO in Bangladesh, and one of the very well-known ones, at least in international development. I'm not sure how much it's known in Canada other than that, but their capacity is quite huge. They have more than 100,000 employees. Most of them are actually in Bangladesh. They have a huge network and a lot of skills as well. They've been operating since 1972, which is a year after the founding of the country. And they have alleviated over 100 million people from extreme poverty from their multi-sectoral approach in the country. So they have a very strong tie with the local government of Bangladesh, obviously at the federal levels, and trickling down all the way to the municipal and lower levels. So maybe that's a good transition into sort of BRAC's response during the Rohingya crisis. So I was there for the Rohingya crisis, and just a disclosure, like, these are my personal views and not BRAC's official views, but I guess this is more of my analysis. So essentially, BRAC has been operating, as a result of its long history in Bangladesh, has been operating in Cox's Bazar for the last 37 years. So coming back to Rhonda's point about strengthening local organizations that may already have capacity, being a very useful thing for the long-term sustainability of the refugees. So currently BRAC has the humanitarian program down there is called the HCMP, Humanitarian Crisis Management Program. Essentially, the focus right now is more on social cohesion, so making sure that the Rohingya refugees rather, are integrating well with the host community in Cox's Bazar, and then also strengthening the humanitarian development nexus, because at one point it becomes a long-term protracted crisis, and then you have to worry about sustainability, and it becomes more of a local government responsibility. And then I think a strong part that BRAC has focused on is the advocacy part, and I think they're able to do it a lot more locally in the country with the government of Bangladesh. And one thing I noticed as an international there, just observing as a Canadian, that BRAC actually has a lot of clout with the government there. They really listen to their advice. They really take it seriously, because they have really been proven to make advance the country out of a lot of problems. So they really do have their ears, and I think that will be very good for maybe from a UN perspective on working with BRAC and in terms of geopolitics and helping align with the repatriation, the voluntary repatriation process. And so in terms of I guess BRAC's capacity there, just locally in Cox's Bazar, they have 2,500 staff, more than 5,000 volunteers within BRAC, as well as the Rohingya community. So they're very large in numbers, and Bangladesh does have a huge population, at least 160 million on the last census, which is very very large, so they take advantage of that. And 53% of BRAC staff are women. So essentially, BRAC currently has a very targeted but multi-sectoral assistance program in the humanitarian development. So they do education. They have lots of learning centers, a lot of healthcare assistance, a little bit of cash-based incentives for families for up to 4 months. And then they have their UPG program, which stands for the Ultra Poor Graduation Program, which is actually a very effective program for alleviating people out of extreme poverty. So those are that's sort of what BRAC does. But I guess from my perspective and working with Rhonda in the past, and just observing sort of how this would fit into the larger discussion here, I think that it's very important, because for local organizations to be engaged and for them to really be strengthened from international organizations, because they're there for a certain amount of time, and then they will have to leave at one point. Perhaps the responsibility shifts more towards the local government and therefore towards the local NGOs as well. And so really strengthening BRAC in its capacity, I think from a funding perspective, also capacity perspective, would be very useful. And you know, there were a lot of interesting stories about how BRAC was really able to mobilize and hit the ground running in the beginning in the Rohingya crisis, because, you know, it really happened overnight. I don't think a lot of people were expecting tens of thousands and then eventually 1 million people almost coming to Bangladesh. And so taking the assistance of a local NGO that has the networks for, let's say, to set up shelters, to get supplies for bamboo, to set up, you know, healthcare centers, to start building things, was, I believe, very useful to have BRAC as a partner with the UN agencies.
Hamza, that's great. Thank you. That's really useful. And I know actually the UN, BRAC became a favorite partner for the UN because they could get things done quickly. They were able to do it. So it was, you know, they actually benefited a lot from funding from that too. But I think thank you, that's really illustrates, I think, the localization, and, you know, it just really become kind of the key point of this, of our discussion today. But, you know, again, sort of emphasizing what Clark also referred to, learning from low-income countries and this issue of reciprocal support and assistance, and how really dividing the world into dichotomous groups is really no longer practical. I mean, developing, poor, rich, you know, it doesn't make sense. I mean, the pandemic has really shown that wealthier countries themselves have now needed help. And I was so interested to see that Médecins Sans Frontières is working in Canada, in Switzerland, in Italy, in France. You know, in Canada, they came in and helped in our long-term care home crisis in Montreal. They worked in homeless shelters in Toronto. They've been helping homeless people in the US and Indigenous populations, migrant workers in the US. It's, you know, they've been taking that humanitarian, that global humanitarian response knowledge and capacity and skill and ability, and helping us with, you know, in our wealthy countries. So it's been fascinating to watch it, and I think the discussion is really continuing. I'd just like to conclude, because I think we're over our time and we need time for questions, but just basically to say, you know, there is a deep reflection underway. There's a continuing discussion. I think the skills that the humanitarian system has, amazing international skills to respond, help us all in times of crisis, are being disseminated to a wider audience than just what we would have called the southern part of the world. So join the conversation at the Future of Aid, on the Future of Aid at the New Humanitarian if you're interested. But hopefully we'll continue conversations on this platform. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, Hamza, and Clark. This was a short, but in my mind at least, a pretty deep dive into how the humanitarian system is working in 2020. And there's a lot of information that at least I was benefiting from. So thank you so much for all your contributions. We're still inviting participants to ask their questions. If you are on the call right now, you can use the Q&A tool to ask your questions. And if you're on YouTube or Facebook, feel welcome to ask your questions there. Meanwhile, maybe we can get started with a couple of questions. One is, how do you see this shift? I guess it's still evolving, but this idea of a shift between humanitarian organizations coming into a crisis to help solve it, and local organizations becoming more enabled and empowered to respond to crisis. In terms of financials, for instance, I guess there's a lot of difference between what an international organization can come and provide versus what local organizations are even capable of managing in terms of zeros in the bank accounts and what each player can bring to the table. So what can help the shifts happen more effectively or more productively for the local organizations? Maybe that's one question to get us started.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I'm going to. Clark, I think, probably has something to say on this too. But I think it begs the question of partnership, doesn't it? The partnership is very important, and I think that's one of the strengths of the humanitarian system, is that generally there is quite an equal balance of partnership between NGOs and UN agencies and government. NGOs and civil society are very, very much part of it, not just one or two. They're there. But the balance between local organizations and international organizations is another one, and they're already partnered up. I think there's no question on that. But it's a question of the partnered in what way? A donor-recipient partnership? What is the relationship? And if it's based on money, transfer of funds, and a donor-implementer type role or partnership, there's a power relationship there that's potentially not equal. So I don't know, Clark, do you have?
My thoughts revolve around moving from the notion of resource mobilization to development financing. In other words, the biggest pot of money is not international. The biggest pot of money comes from ordinary people paying their taxes. And it goes into the national budget. And it need not even be direct. People don't pay direct tax. A lot of people don't pay direct tax. It could be those indirect taxes. So the key question here is, how can local, national influence the way development is being financed out of the government budget? Which is why the question of universal basic income becomes so important. Because a lot of the financing in many developing countries go up to paying for the debt. Perhaps we can negotiate with the big partners a restructuring of that debt and allow money to be set free for things like temporary basic income for the poor and the vulnerable.
Very interesting. Yeah.
The other notion here is that it's also a shift in the mindset. You don't always need for money to go through you as an organization to make an impact. And oftentimes, it's more important that you influence the way local governments and national governments spend their money. And they are often looking for interesting and bright ideas on how to be more effective. And in every government, even including the most, the worst authoritarian governments that I've worked in, there's always this block of reform-minded individuals in government who are interested in making a difference. Not through small projects, but through the way government, local and national, funds humanitarian work, humanitarian development work, and humanitarian development and peace building work.
Very interesting. I think what we'll put in the link to that UNDP recent study on universal basic income, we'll add that in the link for later.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So questions are starting to come in. And one question is, your presentations address several times this idea of top-down approach versus perhaps more and more bottom-up, or at least a collaborative approach. And so what does service, this idea of servant leadership or service mean in humanitarian organizations that swoop in, let's say, to help solve a crisis? How does that help maybe at an individual level, or as an organizations? How can you embody this idea of service to others when addressing the crisis?
Okay. Are there other questions? We could maybe.
Sure. Okay, if you'd rather have a group question, yeah. So there's another question that's slightly different. Is how should the current humanitarian global architecture be reformed, and what are your propositions towards the future, the evolution of that global architecture of the humanitarian system? And so then what would the implications be for the issues of climate related refugees and migrations? How would that impact that? And there's and then yeah, I think we have those two questions right now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the concept of service. I mean, it's interesting because the humanitarian system, the international system that kicks in, is definitely a highly skilled, professional, paid system of people. It's. I mean, they take some volunteers, but volunteers have sometimes caused more harm than good because they have not been skilled. So the idea of, unskilled volunteers just coming to help sometimes has actually been a problem. Although we've all seen first responders in any crisis are the neighbors and the people right there and, helping each other. So on a volunteer basis. But the concept of humanitarian assistance and humanitarianism is really infused with a concept of serving others anyway, and a service to humanity. So it's kind of one of the core raison d'etre of the humanitarian system in itself. But it's a good question. The global architecture question is a tough one. I think there is that discussion going on that, it's a little bit about the whole UN system to some extent, can be seen a little bit as Western dominated institutions or models, but, I think that is shifting. Clark, do you want to add?
Yeah. On service, there are many skills that are important when you're faced with a crisis. And one of the most important skills that I've learned is the ability to listen. And it's not a well-developed skill for people flying in. They're so in a hurry to convey what they know.
Yeah.
Whereas oftentimes it's more effective and efficient to listen first.
Yes.
Now, listening is not just an individual thing. It has to do with the role that impact assessments. Assessments and evaluations is an important tool for listening. Now, how can we ensure that the way we listen through assessments and surveys not only take into account the structures that we are used to, food, NFI, shelter, we also listen to people's voices around dignity, respect, social cohesion, and how do we develop instruments that are able to dive deep into this kind of concerns. When you're faced with a disaster, it's really disempowering and really dehumanizing. And oftentimes, it's not just food and education it's self-respect. It's regaining back your dignity as a person. It's regaining control over, your life. So when I think about service, there is a dimension that's beyond, telling people what to do. It's more about listening to the subtext. Now, on reforming, in the development world, there is an increasing shift to look closely at how do you look at national systems for planning. It's not about your plan. It's about the national development plan for the next 3 to 5 years. It's all about how do you link your plans with the existing national plan. Now, oftentimes that national plan needs to be reformed also, and you need to give space for local plans, to city plans, to village plans. So in a sense, part of reforming the humanitarian architecture is creating the space or changing the roles and changing the mindset. It's how do you influence the local, city, village, provincial, national plan? What role can you play there? What can you contribute in those planning efforts?
I think actually both of your points, Clark, are touching on the issue of consultation, which is a very important issue. And I, there's also this term that's developed in the humanitarian system called communication with affected communities, or communication with affected populations, or accountability to affected populations as well. And it was, the idea behind that was definitely to increase the consultative process and a respectful listening and dignified way of dialoguing with affected communities, not, in the case of refugees, the host communities as well as the refugees themselves.
Can I add something here? So when I was working in the United Nations in Sudan and in Afghanistan, I felt so excited that I was in the front line of crisis response. And then I discovered that most of my work was in Kabul. Maybe I should go to Kandahar and listen more to the people in Wardak. And then when I go to Wardak or Kandahar, most of the people's their work was around the Kandahar provincial capital. Maybe they should go more into the villages. So even within international and local settings, there is an inbuilt city or headquarters bias.
Yes.
So I think when we talk about consultations, it's also finding the tools, the mindset, the approaches that enables us to go beyond a headquarters mentality.
Yes.
Now, that's not to say that headquarters is not useful. It's when I look at the roles that perhaps they can come into a little bit of monitoring and evaluation. Maybe their role in setting standards are important. Maybe their role in identifying strategies for populations that tend to be marginalized at the local level. But it's oftentimes there are local hierarchies that you need to be aware of, that one needs to be aware of. But the mindset is important. Things will start figuring itself out as soon as we get beyond the headquarters mentality.
Great. And actually, building on that last comment, Clark, one question that comes up is those headquarters, one of their functions probably is managing learning, the information flow that is received from the different spots where the crisis is appearing. And so how do we manage learning in the process, learning how to manage the crisis itself, but also how do we share the learning and make it widely available either to local or international partners? So maybe that's a question of interest. This question of producing learning and then sharing it and making it available for others, that might be something of interest. And another question that came up was the example of the Rotary International Organization. And there's this idea that private contributors might become more effective than governmental contributors at some points, or what are the trends that you are looking at regarding these type of interactions?
Yeah, good point. Just on the learning, I mean, there's always very quick after action reviews that are done on a crisis response, and there's real-time evaluations, and there's a lot of self-reflection and after action review. It's pretty rapid, but it is there, and so learning does take place. The private sector angle is important. I think UNHCR has a big push these days on involvement of the private sector in humanitarian response. And a greater involvement of the private sector, not simply as funders, but in other ways. They're looking at all kinds of partnerships and different innovative approaches. I mean, MasterCard, for example, has been very involved. I mean, they're the ones usually producing the debit cards for the cash transfer system. The banking system's involved. IKEA has been involved in building all kinds of refugee shelters. They've come up with all kinds of innovative designs. But there's a lot of, it's an area I don't know too much about, but it's certainly a growing area. I don't know if Hamza or Clark have any views on private sector.
I would be happy to comment on that.
Okay, good.
Since I worked a little bit in fundraising as well, actually a lot in Dhaka. So yeah, absolutely. I think when we did our donor map analysis, we saw that there's a changing shift where donors, larger donors, traditional donors, want to see more return on investment. They want to see more results based on their programming and funding. And sometimes the private sector, actually rather recently, the private sector has been a good engagement partner for programs where they would have essentially an investment with us, maybe something very particular to what they do, like Rhonda had mentioned, the MasterCard Foundation would help with, or with the Gates Foundation, they would have a very specific focus on healthcare and particularly eradicating a specific illness in the country. But just generally, I think we have seen a shift in UN as well as NGOs looking towards private sector engagement for funding. And then there's also something very specific there. And I think the Brookings Institute did an interesting research on this. It's called social impact bonds or development impact bonds. And it's essentially kind of like, it's this idea where a donor or partner, maybe a multiple, like a few of them would invest in a program based on results. And so once they see the result come back, then they would actually, like, for example, there's a wealthy donor who wants to invest in a particular healthcare program in Bangladesh. And let's say the Australian government is really interested in it, but they're not sure whether the results are going to pay off because they haven't seen the success in the past. And obviously, they want to be very accountable to their citizens because it is taxpayers' money. So they will commit on it, and they will say, look, if this goes well, we will actually fund you guys back completely. And if it doesn't, then the onus is on the private sector investment firm. So it's a win-win for the agency, because you will get the funding for your program. Obviously, you want to deliver in the best way possible so that you can get the support of the state. But if you don't, then also the private sector investor has also seen the ROI, perhaps for their CSRs and something like that. So yeah, I think there's a shift there. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. No, that's useful. There was another question actually about a shift to crisis prevention as opposed to crisis response, and that was in the chat. And I think that's a good question. I mean, we haven't talked also about the need to address root causes and underlying drivers of crisis, and really how we can get away from that's a whole nother subject. But crisis prevention is it's a priority of the UN Secretary General. It's supposed to be infused in all UN's approaches these days. It's very important. I think crisis preparation is something the UN humanitarian system does very well. Contingency plans, disaster preparedness plans, that kind of thing. But in terms of prevention, that's another area. I don't know, Clark, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm going to link two questions, the question on learning and the question on crisis prevention. And I want to bring in two things here. One is a lot of after-action reports looking at lessons learned focus on what went wrong or what could be improved. We have a natural tendency to look at flaws in our response. I'm interested really at looking at success stories to scale up.
Yeah.
And I think people get excited about spreading good news. Now, the reason I link that to my second point, and we are losing the after-action report and the way it's done. We are losing a critical constituency in learning, which is young people. And in the development world, basically one of the things that have been done by UNDP is bring together these accelerator labs using hackathons, where people are given problems, where people from all over, young people from all over the world come together in a short, intense moment to devise solutions for a particular development problem. Now, I think that could be applied to crisis prevention, especially if you bring in innovative things like foresight thinking, thinking beyond the current moment. So there's a couple of very, very innovative approaches that young people are using that that we can learn from to make to address these important questions better. So when you think about conflict prevention, it's really good to think about it in a 10-year scale. In other words, let's look at the 2030 agenda.
Right.
Where do we want to be? Where does government, civil society, the international human architecture want to be by the year 2030?
Yes.
What will be our role? And then what is keeping us today from moving closer to that role? That is a foresight thinking question.
Yeah.
And when we think about it that way, we make that nice link between humanitarian work and development, because then we start thinking about the 2030 agenda.
Yeah, that's a nice way to maybe end our discussion, is to talk about that and keep that 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda in mind. I mean, that is supposed to be a vision that we should all be working towards, and I think pushing humanitarian organizations to think about that, even though they only want to think about the immediate and the short term, they have to. I mean, 10 years of humanitarian crisis in dealing with Syrian refugees doesn't make sense anymore. It's not a humanitarian crisis anymore after 10 years. So, we need to have a different approach. So, yeah, I guess we're coming to the end. So just thank you, everyone. I don't know if there's any burning questions. Maybe we can answer them later through emails or whatever, but it's been a great conversation. And I hope this would be the beginning of a series of conversations maybe in this sector. There's so much to talk about.
Yes, definitely. So thank you so much, Hamza, Clark, and of course, Rhonda, for bringing all of you together and sharing. Ethical Business Building the Future, EBBF, really appreciates and values your comments and your experience and the sharing we're doing through a very short 1 hour introduction, getting our feet wet, introduction to the topic. It's so interesting that naturally with the humanitarian works comes a world perspective that allows us to think not just about what is going on in local governments, but also what is going on globally and how do we work for a better world for all of humanity. So I'm sure that those are ideas that are all very near and dear to the hearts of all the participants in the webinar. And I'm pretty sure we'll have to have a follow-up webinar discussing this idea of crisis prevention and how we move towards a more foresight approach and planning on making this world better rather than while taking care of emerging crises, of course. So thank you so much for sharing all your perspectives and approaches. This has been very enriching for everyone, I'm sure, and for me in particular. So really thank you all.
Thanks again. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.